Let's jump into this journey of finding peace for our everyday, real lives. If you would have asked me when I was a child what my favorite Bible story was, I would have told you it was the story of the Good Samaritan. It's a story I treasure even today. It's a story of peace. While traveling, the main character in the story was attacked. Now, the attack stole peace from his physical body. Instead of having a whole, unbroken body, he is left for dead on the side of the road. We're embodied souls. So what happens to our bodies also impacts our souls, our hearts, and our minds. And certainly we can imagine that the attack on the man's body also broke, in some sense, the man's soul, his heart, and his mind. The man was violently attacked by other humans who cared nothing for the man, but instead only wanted money or items, valuables for themselves. The attack caused internal heart trauma as much as it did external trauma. To add to all of this trauma, the man led helpless on the road, exposed and without any protection against wild animals and other would-be assailants. People with the power to help him saw his desperation and they passed right on by, making very little effort, no effort in fact, to help him. They avoided him. Now imagine being tossed on the side of a road, being incapable of moving, feeling like your life was slipping away and hearing someone approaching at a normal gait. You'd probably assume if you heard that person that that person was not about to harm you. This was not a person rushing toward you to attack. Instead, you'd probably assume this was a person who was going about their business but would see you and help. But help did not come from these men. Instead, when those approaching the man realized he was in such need, they passed by quickly. Imagine the trauma of hope lifted and shattered as your life was literally draining out of you. Now think about this. Those who didn't help wanted people to believe they had peace with God. They outwardly seemed very religious, which they hoped would fool others into believing they had a whole relationship with God. They, after all, had fooled themselves into believing that they had peace with God. But in truth, they didn't have peace with God, or at least they weren't living out of a whole, unbroken relationship with God. And the brokenness with God that they were experiencing led to their broken response to the man in need. Instead of operating out of a whole relationship with God, they operated out of a broken mindset. They avoided the man instead of helping to restore the man to wholeness. This would not have been a story about peace if it ended right here, right? Thankfully, it continues. Now, to understand the rest of the story, it's important to note that those who passed the man, they were Jewish. So they were not only religious, they were also Jewish. And the man was Jewish. After the man was avoided by other Jews, a Samaritan came along. Jewish people in that day despised Samaritans, and Samaritans were not too fond of Jews either. If the dying man had any idea that a Samaritan was approaching, he may have felt his hope was lost. But this Samaritan did not act on the centuries-old disdain that Jews and Samaritans held toward each other. Instead, this Samaritan went to the man. And this is what is written about the Samaritan. When he saw him, he took pity on him. So when the Samaritan saw the man, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said. "When I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have had." The Samaritan came from a people with hundreds of years of resentment to cast upon the man. But instead of unleashing fury on the man to finish him off, the Samaritan chose to be a peacemaker. The Samaritan chose, at cost to himself, to help restore the man to wholeness. The Samaritan gave valuable time, resources, mental energy, and commitment to see the man restored physically and beyond. Imagine how the Samaritan's kindness would have been at work bringing healing, not just to the man's body, but to his heart and his mind as well. The man had seen the worst of humanity in action, but then someone who had been labeled the worst of humanity came to his rescue, and he came at cost to himself. Jesus gave the account of the cost, and then Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." Friends, God calls his people he has given identity and position to, people who have received peace, to be peacemakers. It is not an easy mission. It is often a costly mission, but this mission reflects the very heart of our God, who gave his own Son so that we could have peace with him. This week, I am asking God to go after our minds with truth, to let the truth penetrate our hearts, and to cause us to sorrow over the times we've rejected the mission of being a peacemaker and chosen our own way instead. I'm asking God to help us to sorrow rightly, to repent, and to live out the peace he has given us by being peacemakers in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our places of work, and on the socials.